I'm Jordan Valdina. I'm a registered architect and a professional engineer. Designing spaces and connecting people to places they love is what I do. Using the material in this program, my hope is that I may inspire and provide value to you in your journey through our built environment. This is the Architecture Show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecture Show. Sort of dimming light in here, but we're just going to go with it. The style and history of architecture, what I want to talk about today. And not style and history as in the specific styles, maybe we'll touch on that a little bit, or the specific history, maybe we'll touch on that a little bit. But again, our excuse is that there's already plenty of good stuff out there, better than what I would present anyway. What I want to do is talk about some of the general sort of underlying reasons or aspects or kind of, things to think about regarding what is style and what is the history of architecture, kind of what is its relevance, what are some of the things that we see happening in general. So first of all, and this is not because it's first in particular order, but first of all, what is style? And specifically style in architecture, or more broadly, style in the built environment? Well, it's basically, something with a notable feature, something like that, or something that is historically, identifiable, or just identifiable. It's sort of two ways of saying the same thing: notable feature, identifiable historically. What qualifies as notable? What qualifies as identifiable? Well, basically that a lot of people would agree with that, and particularly people of expertise would agree with that. I mean, that's kind of the metric behind most of these things. But I want to touch on that right out of the gates because, you could disagree, and that's an important thing to know. But usually when people are speaking of it, they're speaking about the commonly held notions of style and the commonly recognized relevance of the history of architecture. I'd say a lot of the history, most would agree, is fairly accurately known. A lot of it, not all of it. As the further back you go, the more mysteries there are, especially with forms of building that would decay and leave no remnant of themselves. Wood in general, wood construction in general, given enough time, will just decompose, and there could be literally no, easily anyway, identifiable record of it. So, but once things became a little more permanent, and once the means of recording, even just in written form and sketches of what people were encountering in different parts of the world, then a history is written. But again, what qualifies as notable features and what qualifies as historically identifiable, there's some interpretation, especially on the style side. Then there's the concept of style, of something having style, which is it qualifies as somehow, has something special, usually artistic, or something special about it that qualifies for this style. Okay, so that's just a little, the background, like I usually do. So, the link to history with style is the first place that I want to start. Because, if you go back far enough, structure served a fundamental survival-based function. And you're in a certain environment. You're in an environment that the weather is the first thing, normally, to contend with. Far and away, typically, in regards to structure, the most, prominent design guide, of why was that built that way? Why, and then the result happens to be something you can call a style, right? But it's driven by the weather. It's driven by the materials at hand, and it's then driven by sort of techniques that people knew, figured out, didn't know, whatever, so that you could see certain identifiable styles. A great example of a style in that sense is an igloo. Right? What are the building materials you have to work with? Ice. What's the environment you have to work with? Really, really cold. how do you build a structure that you can stay warm inside, and with that material and those conditions? Well, you could stack up you could do different shapes. Turns out the most efficient shape to heat and the most efficient amount of material is actually that hemispherical shape of an igloo. Now, did somebody logically arrive at that, or more likely trial and error? And if you think about the margins of trial and error in a super cold environment, the margins start to diminish, and somebody figured it out somewhere and ran with it. But tropical huts. Okay, so now it's in a class that people would either say is not architecture at all, which is where I think one's opinion is really welcome. Who gets to say whether something's architecture or not? But that's where you start looking at the definitions that people hold and the metrics. But it's certainly part of the progression in any case. I think everybody would agree with that. So there's this kind of primitive, again, it's how it gets labeled, stage. Then there's just vernacular, so-called vernacular architecture local to a place, sort of how people just built. And generally speaking, this is on the sort of the next step, if it's looked at as a progression from the primitive architecture, is like the vernacular architecture. And that, however, is not as far divorced, not as far removed as one may imagine based on the perceived level of civilization or level of society of an area. Because, again, typically traditional vernacular architecture was driven by things prior to mechanical heating and cooling and the like, and also a much less tamed environment, if you will, just generically speaking. So usually vernacular architecture incorporated a lot of the same drivers in function that then at the very function and available materials and ability to harvest and use those materials, which related to this sort of co-evolving systems of how people lived, where they lived. So that is kind of the groundwork, on which style and history of architecture builds. Later, and only later, was there this driver that became something else, but ideas, that is, and beliefs. But let me qualify that. That was always there. And it would affect, in ways we might not be able to figure out, always identify easily, the shape that was chosen, for example. But on the scheme of things, it was driven functionally, with a survivalistic bent. And then there was the mythology or the culture, the beliefs would affect, but usually those would affect ornamentation, coloration, some gesture. However, that starts to qualify, just generically speaking, as a style beyond it just happens to look a certain way, but an optional, an intentional change. And the inherent link to history, so to speak, the one aspect is through materials at hand, weather conditions that you're responding to, and cultural and religious trends, yes, but always first built on this very sort of survivalistically defined reality of what you could get, how you could build with it, the means by which you could fashion those materials, and the climatic and immediate environment and responding to it, defined in large measure style. Sure, you were looking at one particular group's solution to those conditions, but often you'd see very similar solutions in different places because they're driven out of this necessity. So like the, tropical huts raised up off the ground, using big leaves that were available there as sort of a siding or a roofing, over these sort of temporary boughs, large open areas for cross ventilation where it's very hot. These sort of influences are really driven by people's ability to think and try things out, trial and error, and survive and hopefully do well in those conditions. So that's deemed prehistory. That's typically deemed prehistory and pre-architecture, but making such a distinction is very much kind of up to you and why. Now, I'm not trying to debunk the more conventional usages of those terms, but they're very important to understand that they are applied terms. When does it become architecture? So in any way, you see this fundamental physical aspect of style driven by these conditions. And then as trade routes expanded, as technology spread, and by technology I don't mean more modern technologies so much as methodologies, kind of tricks of the trade of how to, make a better cutting implement, for example. Those things would transmit certain distances and over certain geographies, driven by all sorts of amazing things that just might drive them, including trade, but also including things like conquest and the like. And often the level of permanence and a grandiosity of scale would correspond to something some would call civilization. And so even prior to some of the more what we would call advanced technologies, you had a greater leveraging of ability basically through people, but through certainly scientific type knowledge of how to craft and how to utilize the materials at hand and the systems at hand to create something that we still are not entirely sure how they were able to pull it off. The pyramids, for example. So there is that, okay? And all those things are part of the history. And the techniques would spread, the materials started to spread more and more through trade routes. There was a time when people thought that, I think people were a lot more isolated than more recent evidence has suggested, that even in times quite far in the past, people from certain lands were found, evidence of their existence was found far afield, not just for warfare, not for known trade routes, but it sort of expresses this element of cross-pollination, if you will, of styles and techniques that was happening long before we often realized it in this modern times. And so that was affecting styles in ways we may never know. So the vernacular construction, buildings, or architecture, depending on where you draw that line, or if you do it all, in any case, I just want to kind of highlight that generally speaking, it's not that far removed from the dictates of primitive construction, in the sense of fundamentally driven by function and the baseline of survival, right? It's shelter. And the value systems, the cultural overlays, the mythologies, the religions, their influence in general can be seen more in obvious fashion on the buildings, as it would appear people had more time to do more than just barely get by or to survive and do other things with their time. We don't know what. Perhaps meditate and looking out on things and considering. But a different sort of time than, hey, I want to add a motif, a symbol on my building, a sequence of coloration of paint. The other part of that is we really don't know. We weren't there, and some of these things they might have done, we would never know. But generally we see that trend in history. And that is to say, a trend of greater complexity and greater purposeful ornamentation or play, depending on the case, in what we created, which appears to be related to, yes, an evolution of ideas, an evolution of knowledge, and cross-pollination of ideas from different places, new techniques, but at the same time, and apparently more relevant, was people's greater ability to marshal the activities of survival so that they had more other time to do things such as really start to express themselves in ways that were not just a reaction, even if a very successful and powerful reaction to the forces at hand. Now you had this little more proactive space where people again started to craft something they wanted to express for meaning, for identity, for beauty. So that's how that would appear to be a trend. Different time scales, different levels in different places, but that seemed to be a trend starting to take place as people again variously appeared to be able to survive more effectively, basically, and have more time on their hands to do other things than just try to eat and maintain shelter and warmth and basic safety. And variously in different locations, one could see a confluence of factors whereby there's a marked steps forward. Ancient Greece was, wow, this civilization took place. I mentioned the Mesoamerica, the Egyptian pyramids, the great dynasties of China, some of the early construction in Japan. You could see that things were sort of going to another level. In no case do I mean, just as an individual, to suggest that that means better inherently, so much as just a wider palette and a greater scale of design and construction taking place in these places. And another one such place and time was generally what people call the Renaissance in Europe. And in and around this time there was this, influx of ideas and materials and changing perceptions and imaginations and travel and the new world and different access to materials, different access to cultures, and the aspect of it that could be described as built on the back of very unjust relationships between people had been taking place variously for a long time. And often there was that component of empire and grandiosity. That simply is what it is. It's how a lot of these things took place. Would they have happened otherwise? Would it have looked like? We don't know, but it certainly wouldn't have been what we've seen. Again, in just these materials and just the changing perception of the world would affect how people would think when they were designing. Still, comparatively, there was this, the overarching religion, for example. It hadn't, or at least one that need to be nominally accepted or the hat tipped to it in the construction, for example, of a cathedral. Whether the architect or builder fully believed all the different things that it would be purported they should at that time historically, we don't know. And in fact, some cases we know that they didn't, or more they would add their own little, they would try to kind of sneak in some more personal expression. However, on the scheme of things, as much as there was an artistic variation, and there certainly was, there was total new levels of things being created. On the scheme of things, they may be said, this is open for debate, of course, but they may be said to have been evolving along a classical line. Greater connection to traditional, some context within which it's then evolving on it, as opposed to a clean break and something just utterly different being proposed, but rather sort of a progression and a growth, or at least that was the thought in a lot of the styles. And from that perspective, it could be seen as primitive building, vernacular architecture, civilization and empire, and then sort of even greater levels of that.
This episode continues in part 2. Key life.